Welcome to Chapter 4, The Emergence of Hyper-individualism. Our previous chapter traced 6 developments from the 14th century to the 20th century that collectively contributed to the emergence of liberal individualism. In this chapter, we move to consider the most extreme form of liberalism, namely libertarianism, or hyper-individualism as I prefer to call it, though I will use both terms in this chapter. The term libertarian was first used in the mid-1800s by anarchist communists in France, who saw anarchy as a form of liberty and so adopted for themselves the term libertaire. A few decades later, by the 1880s, communists in the United States began using the term too. But by the 1950s and 1960s, classical liberals adopted the term for themselves. Recall from our previous chapter that classical liberals are those liberals who prioritize laissez-faire capitalism, freedom from overbearing government, and thus limited taxation. And so by the 1950s and 60s, classical liberals had intentionally co-opted for themselves the term libertarianism from the communists. This is surely one of the most ironic turns in the history of political and economic terminology. Regardless, libertarian philosopher David Boaz identifies 8 core libertarian principles. I don't have the space here to identify and discuss each of these, so for our purposes I will instead identify 4 principles of hyper-individualism in its social form. One of these principles is to maximize choice. Philosopher John Rist contends that in the Western world today, choice is seen as the supreme good, so that libertarian choice becomes the identifying mark and essential functioning of modernity, as Rist puts it. Or, as McGill philosopher Charles Taylor puts it, bare choice, irrespective of what it is a choice between, or in what domain, is now the prime value in society today. This prime value or supreme good of maximizing personal choice gets expressed in a number of ways, but most prominently through 2 particular types of choice, one being consumer choice. As social theorist Zygmunt Bauman observes, consumerism has become the principal propelling and operating force in society today. Recall from our previous chapter the emergence of early consumerism through the creation of new forms of money in post-medieval economics. In effect, the consumerism that was made possible 5 centuries ago for that small portion of the population who were merchants and bankers has now expanded in our time so greatly that today the whole of society are consumers, so that today we have hyper-consumerism. With choice as our society's supreme good or prime value, it is no surprise that such a morally ambiguous phenomenon as consumerism has come to take such a central role in society. This, though, is not actually new to our time. Even back in 1920, the English Anglican economist R.H. Tawney expressed deep concern about this in his influential book, The Acquisitive Society. The other preeminent mode of choice in hyper-individualism, in addition to consumer choice, is sexual choice. Traditional Western values of sexual exclusiveness, marital commitment, and gender boundaries are increasingly negated for polyamory, BDSM, and generally pushing the envelope as much as possible. The point is not that boundary-pushing sexual practices are new. In fact, they've always existed in Western culture, but have traditionally been considered social taboos accompanied with public disgrace. The difference is that within hyper-individualism, disgrace has been replaced with celebration, and taboo replaced with labeling the traditional constraints as oppressive. Furthermore, consumer choice and sexual choice are not to be practiced discreetly. For a second outcome of social libertarianism has been the emergence of expressive individualism. Charles Taylor defines expressive individualism as the understanding of life that each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own way, as against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside, by society, or by the previous generation, or by religious or political authority. Certain popular phrases or ideas represent this self-expressivism, such as, be true to yourself, follow your heart, find yourself, I did it my way. Consequently, within today's social libertarian value system, the highest form of moral order is to express or perform one's autonomy, one's individuality, one's authentic self, free of limitations or constraints. Conversely, to not express oneself is considered inauthentic and repressed, and to not overtly support another's self-expression has moved from being somewhat inconsiderate or rude to being oppressive and morally offensive. I'm implying neither support nor critique of this. At this point, I am simply describing our current social world. Expressive individualism is fed by consumer choice and sexual choice. It is fed by consumer choice because as consumer choice expands, there are more and more ways to express oneself through the things one can purchase. In the previous chapter, we saw how this was the case even with the early consumerism of post-medieval economics in the 15th to 17th centuries. Although back then, consumer self-expression was limited to an elite few in society, with a limited range of consumer goods available. Whereas today, self-expression through consumer choice is not merely for an elite few, but rather for almost everyone in society, with a huge range of consumer choice. Expressive individualism is also fed by sexual choice. Zygmunt Bauman observes that contemporary society has become notorious for erasing the boundaries between the private and the public, for making it a public virtue and obligation to publicly expose the private. As psychologist and philosopher Eugène Henriquet puts it, everybody's share of the intimate, everybody's inner life, is now called on to be exposed on the public stage. Physical, social, and psychological nudity is the order of the day. Social media is, of course, a primary means for this. Sexual expressivism, combined with the hyper-individualist desire to minimize behavioral boundaries, is a source of much of our sexual culture today, to the point that formerly scorned sexual practices, such as polyamory, which means multiple consenting sexual partners who know each other, even sometimes living together, and BDSM, bondage, dominance, submission, and sadomasochism, are increasingly legitimated in mainstream media. To illustrate this removing of sexual boundaries, in 2013, Miley Cyrus introduced twerking to the public at the MTV Video Music Awards. As the camera panned the audience, well-known stars looked on in shock and disbelief. But this public display by a celebrity began the process of normalizing twerking, so that today twerking is just a normally accepted cultural practice. Any sense of its public impropriety has significantly diminished. Or to give another example, just a few days before I wrote this text, Bianca Censori, the wife of Kanye West, appeared on the red carpet at the 2025 Grammys wearing a transparent sheer dress. The media ate it up, with headlines such as "Naked Bianca at the Grammys." At the same time, though, Kanye was standing beside her fully clothed, which of course raises further issues around gender roles. Through a long line of public intellectuals from the late 1800s forward, including Nietzsche, Freud, Mead, Beauvoir, Camus, Marcuse, and Foucault, there has emerged into popular culture the idea that sexuality is the heart of individual authenticity. For, as Carl Trueman puts it, while sex may be presented today as little more than a recreational activity, sexuality is presented as that which lies at the very heart of what it means to be an authentic person. Consequently, we have what Trueman calls the triumph of the erotic, which does not simply involve an expansion of the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior, but actually requires the abolition of sexual boundaries in their entirety. So we have arrived at a period in Western cultural history in which unrestricted consumer choice and overt sexual expressivism are the iconic modes of social hyper-individualism. And protecting these are among the fundamental moral norms of our times, as if any other values could only be oppressive. All of this has become so socially normative in Western society, and increasingly exported around the globe, that for its advocates, it feels self-evident that this is humanity's highest form of moral social existence. And to critique all this is to violate the moral order. Just as 2,000 years ago, to critique the rigid hierarchy of Roman society was to violate the Greco-Roman moral order back then. Which brings us to the third effect of hyper-individualism that I want to identify. To recall, the first was maximized choice as the prime societal good or the supreme social value. The second was expressive individualism as the mode of living out these consumer and sexual choices. The third effect is a redefinition of justice. For within this expressive individualist worldview, to quote Brad East, the primary social ethic is recognition of everyone's self-defined quest for individual freedom and self-expression. Therefore, social justice is less about the older themes of economic and class inequality, and more about issues of equality relating to individual identity, self-expression, and personal autonomy. And just as conformist societies have their ways of penalizing those who do not conform to expected values, hyper-individualism also, though ironically, has its means of penalizing those who do not conform to its values and to this view of justice. These penalties are often social, such as being shunned, shouted down, or cancelled, which, it should be noted, can actually come from both ends of the spectrum. The closer a society moves towards one extreme of the spectrum or the other, whether high conformism at one end or hyper-individualism at the other end, the less society permits public discussion of the balance between the collective and the individual, and thus increasingly restricts certain types of speech. Which brings us to a fourth feature of libertarian society today, that the means by which to protect expressive individualism is accumulating rights claims. Everyone starts claiming rights for each and every interest they have. Now, as I said in the last chapter, the creation of human rights has been a deeply important gain for humanity's well-being. Each of us, including myself, benefit greatly from the legal rights we have, enshrined in both domestic and international law. Moreover, Christianity has played an important role in the emergence of modern human rights ideas. Yet, as important as human rights are, there are a number of problems with this phenomena of accumulating rights claims in society, which we will unpack in the next video. I will argue in the next video that we need to seek a balance between individual rights and the common good. There is no algorithm in the universe or mathematical formula that sets what this balance should look like. So that means it is up to us to work this out together as the product of ongoing discernment, discussion, life lessons learned, and observed well-being outcomes, including the use of social science when possible. I will argue that libertarian excess not only harms the common good, but also causes individual harms, for reasons I will describe in the next chapter, as well as in part 2. Libertarianism rejects the idea of mutually dependent relationships between individual and community. The late UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a libertarian, once supposedly said there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. Whether she said this or not is a matter of some debate, but nonetheless this notion certainly captures the libertarian instinct. Consequently, libertarianism is at deep odds with a biblical vision for human well-being. Moreover, while libertarians rightly want to publicly discuss the sorts of harms caused by the conformist end of the spectrum, they are often reticent to publicly discuss the harms caused by their own end of the spectrum. And so it is now time to move to Chapter 5, to examine hyper-individualism's problems more closely. And a quick reminder to please hit the like, subscribe, and share buttons to give this video series some wider circulation. Thank you very much, and we'll see you for the next video.